Internationally acclaimed South African cellist and cultural composer Dr Thokozani Mhlambi is set to embark on a groundbreaking indigenous African creative art forms digital index initiative. Now, it's aimed at preserving indigenous African creative art forms such as songs, poems, and other things that form part of that genre. Dr Mhlambi joins us to discuss this further. A very good evening to you, Doc, and thank you very much for joining us. It's a wonderful initiative that you have thought about here and that you will be establishing. Why was it so important for you to create the space for indigenous art forms that are uniquely ours?
Good afternoon to you and to your listeners. You know, I don't think people understand this concept of intangible cultural heritage and the value of that enough. I mean, we know that, for example, in the Cape, we have names such as rooibos that have been preserved and now been uniquely used for the things that come from that particular region. We know that in places like France, terms such as champagne have become quite protected in terms of who's allowed to use those terms such as champagne. If you're producing sparkling wine anywhere else in the world, you're not allowed to use it unless it comes from the region of Champagne. And so just the same as well is that what you find is a lot of African creative art forms, they're always being recalled and pasted in ways that trigger something either in listeners, or whether it's Beyonce using Spanzula or Paul Simon years ago using Ladysmith Black Bambazo, or people such as Solomon Linda being used by Walt Disney. African art forms are always being recalled and being activated in the world in certain kinds of ways. And there's nothing wrong with that, because us as creative people, that's what our work is. It's to blend things, it's to mix things in ways that allow us to think of the modern situation in a new way. So this platform, really what it aims to do is to convene African phenomena. So the African phenomena is not only guest, also, hey, that thing is song, and so eventually that it's known and it's got a public presence, it's got an institutional credibility that allows our art forms as they exist in our diversity, whether it's music, poetry, and dance, to have a spiritual center.
Now, there's no shortage of creative art forms across the African continent. And I wonder, as you put together this digital index, how challenging do you foresee creating this catalogue of the vast art forms that exist and have been created over the years? Do you foresee it to be? Or are you fairly confident that this is something that will be put together, not seamlessly, but fairly with little challenge, if you will?
Well, I think I'm excited because there's first the potentiality of the interconnection between different African territories. You know, and I think because of South Africa's long history of isolation within the rest of the African continent, particularly in the Pan-African movements that were occurring in the 20th century, I think we are very well posed to begin this process, but because the process is also about recovering our connection to the rest of the continent. And so the idea right now is to begin with the Kuluma languages, Tefula languages, such as Zulu, Xhosa, Iswati, Ndebele, Zimbabwean Ndebele. And already with that, we've got quite a big chunk of Southern Africa covered. And so the idea would then be to begin to excavate some of those similarities and some of those song concepts and storytelling aspects that are similar between these communities that live between these various countries in Southern Africa. And then obviously, as we begin to extend that and gradually include the Sotho-Tswana languages, which already includes then South Africa and Botswana and Lesotho. And so I'm saying this process is also a lot about our rediscovery in our place in Africa. So that as we begin to say things like South Africa is the gateway into the African continent for investors and for people from overseas, we know that we are also finding our gateway into Africa ourselves, so that Africa is not only just a place for exploitation or for big multinationals who come and have their business in Jersey or their their cloud facility in Cape Town in order to grab and clamor for all these African things. So we're saying there's another locus of imagining our African interaction as well. That's saying it can be imagined as wholly owned in Africa. The intellectual property can belong to us as Africans, so that we can also be able to make those deals on a global scale, knowing that we've established entities that are really protected and with the right kind of intellectual property design as well.
Yeah, so you've just described some of the phases that the index will be put together. What about stakeholder involvement? Who are the key stakeholders that are going to see the creation and the growth and the preserving of this digital index?
Really, the stakeholders should be our communities themselves, the communities that own this material. So, for example, one of the people I can think of, a name I can recall is one of our research assistants did an interview with Mr. Gumbi in Jozini, you know, and those are really the stakeholders, the people that our communities recognize as the cultural experts or custodians of sorts. And so that it's not only that this idea of expertise and this idea of custodianship is always emerging from the academy, because today it almost looks as though the people who are experts are professors and so forth in universities. But really, those people aren't the experts. They're not people who practice cultures and people who are at the nexus of the creation and the development of new cultures. And so I think giving an institutional home to something like this, it means that that man in Jozini, that woman in Lusukisiki, anywhere in the country becomes in a way validated, not validated anymore by this approval that's coming from outside or a white gaze or European gaze, but a validation that says technology is actually ours as well. As African communities, we belong to that global community of technology practitioners. We've got our phone, we've got a mobile device, and we can click onto these things and access this information for our own references, or for your grandchild who's born of African parents, but now she grew up in China or in Germany, and now they are being required to find their roots again as African people, but they don't quite know how to do that. This kind of platform then becomes a gateway for people to rediscover their own presence.
Thank you so much for that. That is South African cellist and cultural composer Dr Thokozani Mhlambi joining us to speak about a wonderful African Creative Art Forms Digital Index, which has recently been launched, coinciding with Africa Day. And of course, as you've just heard, the opportunities that it will offer for communities to share their creative art forms that are uniquely South African or African, if you will.